Hey everybody, welcome to the video. This is the first video in section 3. It's called security. This particular video is about managing user accounts. We're going to be talking about Mongo user account management. It's a lot like herding cats. So without further ado, let's jump in and see what we're getting ourselves into. First concept I'd like to talk about is the difference between users and roles. Mongo uses what's called role-based access controls to grant users permission to go into your database and do stuff. Now, if you have user authentication enabled in your database, which by default, as we've seen, it is not, then what you're basically saying is that for a user to have access to your database, they have to have one of two things. Well, they actually have to have two things. They have to have an account name and a password. And then as the database administrator, you have to define their role within the database. And what the role does is it defines what actions that they can perform against what resources. So when you create a user account, you're going to create the user account by specifying the user's name and their password. And then you're going to grant them one or more roles according to their need. And so that's the basic difference. The user defines who can access the database, and the role defines what they can do once they have access. And like I said earlier, Mongo uses role-based access controls. And the reason why this is important is we want to ensure a system of least privilege whenever we create a user. So in other words, if you got a guy in your company who comes on and says, hey, I'm the guy that's going to be running reports, then you can limit their access to the particular database that they need to access, and you give them read-only access because all they need to do is create a report. Whereas a developer, you may want to give them a DB owner level of access to a new database, which means that they can basically do anything they want in that database because they're the owner. And this is also a good way of separating or segregating your developers from your production environment. So example, it would be within your development database, you can give all your developers DB owner level permissions on all databases and let them go crazy. But in the production database, you would also create an account for the developers, but you would limit their access to read-only access because you don't want developers mangling production data. So again, Mongo enforces this through a combination of user accounts and roles. And again, roles define who can do what, where, or who can perform what actions on what resources. And then you always want to make sure that this is enforced by using a system of least privilege. So in other words, you just don't want to grant everybody root because you don't want to go through the trouble of managing users. If you're going to do that, don't even bother creating users. Make sure that your users have just exactly what permissions they need to be able to perform their assigned tasks. There's something else I want to talk about called the localhost exception. In the current release of Mongo, which is 3.4, and the version we've been using for these videos, which is 3.2, because that's the officially supported version under Ubuntu 16.04, there's a concept of the localhost exception. And what that basically means is Mongo comes out of the box with no user access controls. There's not a default user account set up. As a matter of fact, as we'll see, there are no user accounts set up. So the localhost exception says that when you want to create a user, you have to do so on the local host only. And that first user you create should be an administrative user. And from that user account, once you enable login, that user will be able to create other super users on databases and other users on other databases. So in the first step, as of version 3, you create an administrative account or a super user account in your admin database. And then once you've gotten that created, you log in, authenticate as that admin user, and then you can create other user accounts as necessary for however many databases that you happen to have in your current installation. Again, like I said, prior to 3.6, which hasn't officially been released yet at the time I'm recording this, that no users existed by default. And this is not a security flaw, regardless of what you may have read in the media in 2017. This was pretty much by design. Mongo was designed as an open source system. Everybody has access to it. And as a database system, it usually sits on the back end in a virtual private cloud somewhere. it certainly shouldn't be deployed in a production environment facing the internet directly. You're just asking to be hacked at that point. And as we saw in 2017, a lot of incorrectly deployed databases got hacked or accessed illegally by users who found out that the database administrators made them directly available on the internet. Not a good strategy, not a good thing to do. The other thing I want to talk about is a general strategy for user management in the form of the roles, and there's a hierarchical approach to this. And starting from the top down, when we're creating users, we want to start by creating a super user or a root user that is stored in the admin database. Now, I've referenced admin database before in this video, and I haven't talked about it up until now. But by default, Mongo comes with an admin database, and like the name implies, it takes care of the administrative overhead or the administrative settings for your particular installation. So if I want to create a super user account, a root account, if you will, and there is a role called root, then I would create this in the admin database. And the admin database is the top level database. It's the top dog. And by virtue of having a user in the admin database, that allows me to grant through that user account privileges and other databases that I have in my installation. So at the next level, you have the DB owner, and this is the owner of a particular database. And that DB owner owns all of the collections within that database, and they can pretty much do whatever they want, like the root user, but only within that database. So the root user can do anything to any database, but the database owner is the root user only for a particular database. And then we have a sublevel of a user administrative account called the user admin account. And that user admin account is usually used to grant privileges to your database users. So in other words, you could create a user admin account, and that person's only job is to manage all the users that have access to that database. And that's something you would probably want to do if you're managing a department that has, a few hundred users that need access to your database. You're going to want to offload that responsibility to a senior person by granting them an administrative level to manage your users so that, you don't have to. And I've actually worked for places where they have multiple administrative accounts that can grant users access to the database. You also have user administrative accounts that do nothing but backup and recovery. That's another example of a user admin account for a database. And then the last level is the users. And of course, the users are mainly concerned with reading and writing data to the database. And those permissions are usually set up to either read-only access or both read and write access. And again, these roles are defined or assigned to the respective databases. So it's possible where a user could be an administrator in one database and a user in another database, and then a severely restricted user with read-only access in a third database. Again, there's not a limit on the number of roles you can assign to a user account in Mongo. However, in most application environments, if you have, and you should, enable user accounts, then what you're going to end up with is pretty much a super user account. And then for my purposes, for my application, when I'm writing software to access Mongo, I have a user level account that can not only read and write to the database, but it can also do things like create and drop indexes and basically manage the internal structure of the database. So it's kind of both a user administrative account and a user access account. Okay, moving on. To create a super user account, which again is the first account that we want to create when we're turning on user access control in Mongo, we want to connect to the Mongo client by typing in Mongo at the command line. And we're going to get to the prompt, and we're going to want to switch to the admin database by typing in use admin. And then we're going to want to create the administrative account within the admin database. And once we do that, we're going to exit the Mongo client, and we're going to restart Mongo with access control enabled. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can pass in --auth on the command line. Remember the system.d control files we set up to auto start Mongo? You could put the --auth in there. You could type it in on the command line, or you can set it up so that it's enabled via the configuration file. And I'll show you how to do that as well in the next video. The other thing that we want to do, well, hold on. Let's talk about sharded clusters first. The only difference between sharded clusters and single instances is that instead of connecting to the Mongo client, we're going to connect to the Mongo S client or the shard client. Again, we're going to use the admin database and we're going to create the administrative account on the database. And the difference for a shard is that we're going to want to create an administrative account on each shard. So remember, Mongo S is a service for sharding. It's not the same thing as the shard itself. So as the database administrator, what you're going to want to do is create the admin account in Mongo S. Then you're going to want to log into the Mongo client on each shard and repeat the steps as if it were a single instance. In other words, you're going to create a user account in the admin database for that shard. You're going to grant that account the superuser privileges or whatever privileges you're going to grant to it. And you're going to do that for each shard in your cluster. And the important distinction here is that that account is not the same as the account you created in Mongo S. In other words, those are exclusive, mutually exclusive accounts. And Mongo S doesn't know anything about the accounts that you create on the shard and vice versa. It's inaccessible to Mongo S. But what it gives you is a way of accessing tables that are stored on a shard that are not sharded. And you've got secondary level access to a particular database collection. Once you've created these accounts on the Mongo client in the Mongo single instance node or on the Mongo shard and the Mongo S clients, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to disable the localhost exception, and I'll show you how to do that as well in the next video. It's basically you want to enable the local authentication bypass variable by setting it to false, which means that from that point moving forward, there is no more localhost exception. You've enabled authentication with the --auth directive, and now all users that access the database have to have a user account and a password in order to do so. The secret to creating users is right here in the createUser command, and you use the same createUser command regardless of whether or not you're creating an administrative account or a user account. And every user you create is stored in either the admin database, if you're creating an administrative account, or it's stored in the database for which you're granting access to a particular user. And you can also create administrative accounts within the local database. So in other words, I believe, if you recall, I have a database in my shard called giva_namaste. If I was going to create the database owner account for that database on the shard, I would connect to that shard, connect to the Mongo client on that shard, and I would create a user, call it admin, on that database, and I would assign it a role as DB owner for that database. Anyway, when I create a user, be it in the local database or in the admin database, I'm basically creating a document, and a document is just a record within a collection. So in JSON format, the document has the following fields. It has a user field, which we define the user login account name. It has the password field, which is abbreviated to PWD, and these are column names, so you can't change them. The PWD field requires a string, which is a clear text password. That's the password that the user will type in when they log into the system. You have another field called custom data, and if you're going to use custom data, it's a key value pair. You can use multiple fields, and it's basically any information that you want to put in there. So in other words, if you want to put in there that admin is really Bob at extension 505, then that's the information that you can put in custom data. Again, it's not limited. It's any key value pair that you want to provide. And then finally, the roles, and roles is a subcollection or an array, and you can either specify a role for that user by a database, or you can assign a global role for that user that applies to all databases. So in other words, If I wanted to create a user as a root user, would have all access to all databases in the system, I would not say role root, comma, db admin, which of course would grant root level access to the admin database, but it would not grant root level access to all databases. Instead, I would say roles, square bracket, and then just the word in parentheses root or DB owner or user admin any database or whatever predefined role I would want to assign to it. And I can also add multiple roles. For example, in the green below right here, you see that I'm creating a root level user that can read write any database and user admin any database, so they can create indexes, drop databases, create databases, whatever, because they have multiple defined roles, but those roles haven't been bound to or associated with a particular database. After you create your administrative user account, the first user account, to bypass the localhost exception, then you want to restart your Mongo service. And that would either be your Mongo daemon if you're running on a single instance node, or it would be your Mongo S service if you're running on a sharded cluster. And when we restart, implying that you restart with the --auth command, or you restart with the appropriate changes in the configuration file so that Mongo knows that authentication is now enabled. And again, in the next video, I'm going to demonstrate all this, how to create a user administrative account for both a single node instance and for the sharded cluster we created in the previous videos. And then here's some links for you to research on your own time to understand how role-based access controls work within Mongo database. So I'm going to wrap this up, and I'll see you in the next video.